We're absolutely delighted to be joined today by Professor Sir John Curtice, who's released a report with the ERS this very day, The Power of Preferences, STV in Scottish local elections. And we've had some good media coverage for it as already has started. We're trying to make the campaign and make the case for STV in general, but specifically at the moment in local elections. And it's really good to be able to use the example of Scotland as we head into the fourth iteration of using STV. We've had a phenomenal number of people register and sign up for tonight's event, so I don't want to take up any more time than is necessary before turning over to Professor Curtice, but it's really wonderful to have him with us. Everyone will know who he is, Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde and Senior Research Fellow at the National Centre for Social Research, and has been working with the ERS for a long time on the use of STV in Scotland. There's actually a lot of use of proportional representation in the UK, far more than opponents of our reforms would like the public to believe, and ERS has been at the forefront, along with others, at achieving that state of play. We did a report last year on the fact we've had 2 decades of the use of PR in devolved institutions. So it's out there, it's working well, and as campaigners and believers in a better democracy and in a better politics that proportional representation can offer, then we should provide the platform for that by changing the rules. So the format is that I'll hand over to John, and then we will take questions throughout his presentation on using the function, and then at the end set aside as much time as we're able to get through that. This series that we do is normally just for ERS members, but because of the importance of the report and obviously the appeal of our speaker tonight, we've opened it up to our supporters as well. But if as you're listening and reflecting on these arguments, you'd like to be more involved in our campaign, then please head over to our website and join the ERS, and also our petition to achieve STV for local elections in England, which is a very important campaign for ERS at the moment. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to you, Professor Sir John, and hear about your research on the 2017 local election results in Scotland and what it all might mean next month for the 2022 local elections.
Thank you very much, Darren. First of all, let me just say thank you very much to the Electoral Reform Society, not only for organising this webinar, but also making the resources available that made this report possible. Behind this exercise is quite a lot of rather difficult and careful work, collecting the data from the various reports that come from the electronic counting system in Scotland. And I'm grateful for all the support for that. And I should say, by the way, although ERS have published this, and I'm perfectly well aware that they, of course, have their particular interest in STV, they have in no way had any influence or attempted to exercise any influence on the analysis that's been conducted. There will now be the usual obligatory slight funding on my part as we move to sharing my screen. Because this presentation will be done through slides. I've called this the power of preferences, essentially because what I want to do in particular is to show how both voters' use of the preferential voting system that STV affords, and also the consequences of voters casting preferences, have become rather more important since the first introduction of STV for Scottish local elections in 2007, and to suggest, though obviously this is more speculative on my part, that this may even be more clearly the case in the elections that are taking place next week. So I'll talk a little bit about the broader context, but essentially this is really primarily focusing on the way in which the lower preferences, not the first preferences, the lower preferences could make a difference to how this election turns out. Now, just in case there's anybody in the audience who's not intimately familiar with the single transferable vote system, just a quick introduction. The crucial thing about this system, which distinguished it from for virtually any of the other systems that are currently in use in the UK, with the partial exception of the supplementary vote system, which the UK government is anyway in the midst of getting rid of anyway, is that voters are invited to vote for candidates in order of preference. They can vote as many or as few candidates as they wish. Candidates are elected if they reach the quota, and the quota looks like a rather complicated mathematical formula, but essentially, if you've got a 3-seat ward, the quota will be a quarter of the vote plus 1, which is arithmetically the smallest share of the vote that only 3 candidates can reach. So once you've got 3 candidates who have reached that number, it's impossible for any other candidate to reach it. So that's how the quota is reached. Now, the first part of the election is very, very familiar. We add up the first preferences. But as is usually the case, if fewer candidates for the number to be elected have reached the quota, if a candidate reaches the quota on the first preferences, they're home and dry, they can relax, they can just watch the rest of the count. But as is nearly always the case, not all candidates have, not all the positions have been fulfilled. Then basically you then start transferring ballot papers in accordance with the second and subsequent preferences expressed by voters on their ballot paper. First of all, the candidate's done really well and got more than the quota. You transfer their surplus votes in accordance with allowed transfers. And then once you've got through that process, if we still got candidates to be elected, you would start eliminating candidates systematically, one by one, from the bottom of the count until eventually we have got the requisite number of people elected. Relatively complicated system of counting, although it's counted by electronically in Scotland, so it's relatively quick. But for voters, frankly, it's relatively straightforward. You just vote in order of preference rather than just putting an X or X's on the ballot paper. The system is relatively proportional, but the proportionality doesn't just depend on the first preferences. It also depends on the transfers, and that's the bit I'm focusing on this evening. The other thing, of course, is then, however, crucial about the system and does distinguish it from pretty much anything else that's currently in operation in the UK, is that parties do not nominate as many candidates as there are seats. If you do that, you actually potentially damage your chances for reasons we can go to in the Q&A if you want. But basically, what parties want to do, they'll want to put up one candidate in most wards if they're trying to be systematically competitive. But beyond that, they basically put up as many as they think they've got a realistic hope of winning. And one of the questions about any election is, do the parties call it correctly? And as I will show you, they didn't all do so in 2017. The Scottish implementation of STV has its own particular quirks. The most important one is that hitherto, at least, all wards were only electing 3 or 4 councillors. That actually is the smallest implementation of STV anywhere in the world. Usually you have 4 or 5 and sometimes 6-member seats or constituencies. But because the Labour Liberal Democrat coalition that introduced this system after 2003 wanted to limit its proportionality, they insisted that it should be 3 or 4-member wards only. Now, since then, since the 2017 election, some increased flexibility has been introduced. Some of the island councils don't like the fact that individual islands can't have their own individual ward. So there is now the possibility of doing that. There will actually be one island ward electing 1 councillor this time on Arran. But also some rather greater flexibility has been introduced more widely, that you can now have 2, but also 5 member wards. But the effect of that will not be evident until the next local elections, which are scheduled for 2027. And we'll see whether or not that increases the average ward size at the moment, which, as you can see, is just under 3.5. So it does therefore mean it's a pretty high quota. It's not easy for small parties to get elected under this system. The boundaries have been changed in the 4 island councils, Western Isles, the 2 Northern Ireland councils, and also in North Ayrshire. But that's it. Otherwise, it's exactly as it was in 2017. So there are a few Scottish quirks to the system. Now, the first thing we have to remember about any sort of local elections is the baseline. And the baseline is almost prehistory. It's May 2017. The last elections in Scotland are as long ago as that. Now, these are elections that were held after Theresa May had faithfully called the 2017 UK general election, but before it was held. The UK election itself was held 6 weeks later. There were 2 striking characteristics to the outcome. The first is that although the SNP came first, they didn't actually do any better than they had done 5 years previously in 2012. And of course, 2012 was before the 2014 EU referendum, in the wake of which the SNP became much stronger in Scotland, certainly in particular for UK general elections. They got 50% of the vote in 2015. So it came as something of a surprise that the SNP did no better than they had done in 2012. But the second key characteristic was that the Conservatives came in with 25% of the vote. This was their best performance in any election in the devolved era, and for a while before that too, and indeed it was followed 6 weeks later by the Conservatives doing even better in the UK general election. So the Conservatives are defending a high baseline, although it has to be said that the Conservatives have come second in every election in Scotland since and including 2016. But still, these were always looked like perhaps rather difficult elections for the Conservatives, though you will notice that when it comes to the seat outcome, the Conservatives actually don't do that much better than Labour than you might expect, given the 5-seat cap. And there are a couple of reasons for that, some of which we will cover later on in this presentation. So the other thing to note is this. Notice that independents do relatively well under the system. One of the reasons why it got it recommended for Scotland when the Labour and Liberal Democrat coalition set up a commission to see what should be done was that in rural Scotland, independent councils were still relatively common, and it was argued by the commission that therefore this was a system of PR that was most commensurate with independent councils because it is a candidate-based system, and therefore people can vote for independents if they wish. Independents are not as numerous as they were in rural Scotland, particularly in the mainland Highlands. But on the other hand, we do now get a scattering of independent councillors getting elected in the central belt in a way that they did not under the first past the post system. And as you can see, they still get about 10% of the vote. Although again, this is something that we will come back to further on in the presentation. First thing, how many candidates got put up in 2017? And this to show you one of the reasons why the Conservatives didn't do as well as they might have expected. You can see that despite the fact that Labour ended up coming third and Conservatives coming second, so far as their nomination strategies are concerned, Labour clearly expected to do better than that, and the Conservatives didn't really expect to do that well. But both of them were being more conservative in the number of candidates they were putting up than were the SNP, who was still putting up a large number of candidates. You can see the nomination strategy more clearly, however, if we actually look to see the number of wards, the number of candidates they were putting up per ward, and how many one-member wards there were, and how many wards were they putting up two candidates. You will see that for the most part, the SNP, the modal SNP strategy was to put up two candidates. So they put up two candidates virtually everywhere, which is a relatively optimistic strategy. Labour 50-50 between one member and two member, but notice that the Conservatives virtually everywhere only put up one candidate. And in the event the Conservatives did so well, they undoubtedly undernominated. There were indeed actually 6 wards where the one Conservative candidate won 2 quotas. So if they'd split the vote between 2 candidates, they would have got two elected. And there's a handful of other wards where the Conservatives were very close to 2 quotas. So the Conservatives almost undoubtedly underperformed in part because they didn't realise how well they were going to do. The other parties were being somewhat more realistic, but Labour in the SNP probably in the end were rather unrealistic. What's happening this time? While the Conservatives are certainly fighting putting up more candidates than they did last time, Labour are being more conservative in their strategy, as indeed actually are also the SNP. Notice on the right-hand side, the number of independent candidates is down. Now, I've taken this from Ballot Box Scotland, who've gone through the task of going through all the nomination papers. I think probably here there's a little bit of disagreement between us about what counts as an independent. Independence in my tally includes people like East Kilbride, Independent Alliance, etc. And I'm not quite sure what Ballot Box Scotland have done. So it may be that the decline in independent candidates is not stark as that, but I suspect it is down, and that may be one of the things to be looking at after this elections. Others are certainly back up. This is partly Alba, 111 candidates. The Scottish Family Party also fighting a lot as well. So even though small parties don't do well in this election, we've got a lot of more in the way of small party candidates. Now, I'm going to move on now to how voters use the ballot paper. But one of the issues that is still there with the use of STV in Scotland is that it does generate rather more in the way of people who just cast an invalid vote. And we're almost undoubtedly doing so by accident, because the principal reason why it's an invalid vote is they put 2 or more X's on their ballot paper. And in fact, even it's not just as compared with first past the post in local elections, but even as compared with Northern Ireland, including Northern Ireland local elections, the level of invalid votes is higher. Almost undoubtedly, one of the disadvantages is that this is the only election in Scotland where people get the chance to do that, whereas in Northern Ireland, it's what happens in all elections apart from Westminster. So voters are probably less used to it, but there probably is also still here room for voter education to get the number of invalid votes. But beyond that, however, the interesting thing to note, and this is where we're beginning to get into the power of transfers, is that most voters do at least cast more than 2 preferences. They have done from the beginning, but in both 2012 and 2017, this was by far and away the predominant thing that voters did. But also what you will notice that in 2017, 3/5 of voters were casting at least 3 preferences. This was up on 2007 and 2012. And given that it was very rare, as you have seen, for a party to nominate 3 candidates in a ward, this means that the majority of voters in 2017 were expressing preferences for at least 2 parties, or at least a party and 1 or more independent candidates. And to that extent, at least, therefore, voters were not simply picking a party. They were using the opportunities of the system to do a bit more than that. Now, when it comes to 4 or more preferences, then it tails off quite rapidly. So 1, 2, 3 works, 1, 2, 3, 4 less so. But even so, you still got around 3 and 10 people doing that. So preferences are proving to be more common. Now, that said, what undoubtedly is true is that this sounds a bit dire. This is the non-terminal transfer rate, i.e. this is what happened to the ballot paper to the transfers when in wards where these parties put up 2 or more candidates, one of the candidates is eliminated either because they're elected or because they're bottom of the count. What happens to the votes? Now, as you can see, not everybody votes simply straight down the ballot paper. It's only around 3/4 or so of voters who are doing that. And it does vary by party, but still undoubtedly party does provide a pretty important cue for many a voter, and that, you know, the majority of voters, if they're going to vote Conservative 1, will vote Conservative 2, and something for the other parties. But there are nuances there, and some people do engage in the ability system to go Conservative 1, Labour 2, SNP 3, Conservative 4, or whatever. That said, the other thing that certainly is true, and it's basically an issue with voters who just want basically to express a preference for a party, is it still remains the case that if you're higher up on the ballot paper and you are one of 2 or 3 candidates, you've got a better chance of being elected than your running mate. The one group of people who tend to buck that are the incumbent councillors. There's been a lot of debate both before 2017 and again before this election as to whether the order of the ballot papers should be changed. The Scottish Government keeps on consulting. They keep on being told, however, there are lots of disadvantages with the alternatives. So we're still back with alphabetically ordered ballot papers, but this is still continuing to be the subject of discussion. And certainly the parties arguably are not successful enough in managing their vote when they're putting up 2 candidates to try to, in order to reduce the effect of the position on the ballot paper. The parties, of course, should be splitting their wards to tell voters to vote, some people to vote for the higher candidate 1, but other people to place the lower candidate 1. But anyway, what happens when the parties no longer have a candidate in the count? And this is where we can get an indication of how people use their ballot paper when they get the chance to vote, to give a lower preference to another party. So the way we can get at this is to look at those instances where one of the 4 main parties, their last candidate in the count is being eliminated, but the other 3 main parties still have a candidate in the count. The first thing to note is, as you might expect from what I said so far, is that in this situation, most voters do express a lower preference. It's only around 3 in 10 who don't. The second thing to note is how the constitutional fault line is very clear in how people transfer in 2017. Relatively small numbers of Conservative, Labour and Liberal Democrat first preference voters, because that is what for the most part these are transferred to the SNP. If people transfer, they transfer to other unionist parties or to independent candidates, or sometimes to others. And equally on the other side, notice the SNP. The 46% transferring to others will be overwhelmingly will be Greens, and very few SNP voters switch or transfer to Conservative, Labour or Liberal Democrat. So the constitutional fault line undoubtedly shaped the pattern of transfers in 2017. And indeed, the extent to which it did so was greater than was the case in 2012. There's a lot of stats here, I won't go through all of it. First thing to note is that particularly Labour and SNP voters were less likely to fail to express a lower preference. So the number of non-transferable Labour and SNP ballot papers was markedly lower in 2017 than it was in 2012. So again, more evidence that voters were using the system. Transfers matter more. The level of transfers between the unionist parties in all cases is up, particularly true of Labour. So in the case of Labour, the proportion of their voters whose lower preference goes to a unionist party is double what it was in 2012. And equally, those transfers from unionist parties to the SNP, they're all down. And meanwhile, the proportion of SNP voters that transfer to one of the 3 main unionist parties is also down quite markedly, and the proportion transferring to the Greens is up markedly. So again, you can see the constitutional fault line is more important than you would expect, than we saw in 2012. So the system is therefore enabling voters on the unionist and on the nationalist side of the division in Scotland to vote consistently for their side of the constitutional argument. What about the Greens? Well, this is what happened to the Greens when their candidate, and they usually only have one candidate, was no longer in the count. You can see they overwhelmingly went to the SNP, and much more so than was the case in 2012. So the way in which the two parties were allied on the constitutional question becomes much more prevalent, and indeed fear of them transferred to any of the unionist parties than was the case in 2012. And again here too, fewer of them cast votes that weren't transferred. Now, what about the impact of all of this? The first thing to note is what proportion of candidates was actually elected on first preferences. You can see this was pretty important, relatively important for the Conservatives, but much more important was in 2012. That reflects their greater popularity. But for Labour and the SNP, transfers mattered more. And in general, only 39% of candidates were elected on first preferences in 2017 as compared with 44% in 2012. So here's again further evidence. Transfers mattered more to the outcome. But what also becomes clear, and where transfers matter, is to look to see how many candidates got elected even though they were not in the top 3 or 4 candidates on first preferences, and how many got elected even though they weren't in the top 3 or 4. Now, the experience here varies by party. The Conservatives ended up there with having 40 candidates who ended up being in the top 3 or 4 on first preferences, but they didn't get over the line. And if you looked at and this reflects the fact that of the unionist parties, the Conservatives find it most difficult to get transfers. Only 6 Conservatives who weren't in the top 3 or 4 got over the line. Labour and the Democrats, in contrast, are able to get transfers. But here, equally, the SNP lose out from the fact that they're not picking up much in the way of transfers from any of the unionist parties. So they, in net terms, were losing out on people not getting elected, even though they were there on the first preference. And you notice the independents also profit a great deal from lower preferences. But the grand total means that in 2017, 101 councillors were elected, even though they were not in the top 3 or 4, and that was well up on both 2012 and 2017. So transfers, lower preferences mattered in a way that was not previously true. Okay, let me then quickly move to the current backdrop, and including why preferences might now matter even more, but also the constitutional fault line perhaps matter even more. This is looking at where the parties stand in the polls now as compared with 2017, and also that becomes more difficult back to 2012. Headline number 1, the Conservatives are undoubtedly in a weaker position, and it looks as though that there is a battle for second place, and that the Labour Party might perhaps become the second largest party in Scotland for the first time since 2016. And that has potential implications for the internal politics on the unionist side. The SNP are probably more popular now than they were in 2017, but as you will see in 2017, their popularity didn't necessarily all come through to the local elections. So I think there's much more uncertainty, but one would expect the SNP to be doing better. This is a relatively easy wicket for them. So unless the Greens don't do extraordinarily well and start taking lots in the way of not just votes, but seats away from the SNP, we may be seeing the SNP doing better, the unionist vote becoming fragmented, and that out of these local elections, the SNP will certainly claim that this is evidence that there is greater support for independence, etc., when of course in practice that will not necessarily be true. The second thing to note, I've already shown you how the constitutional fault line was more important in 2017 in the way in which voters expressed their transfers. There's reason to believe that it may well be even more so in 2022. To demonstrate this, I'm showing you how people's vote under first past the post, both in 2017 and 2021, relates to their current independence preference. So the thing to note is that in 2017, about 75% of people who currently supported independence were voting for the SNP, whereas only 12% of no voters were. So there was already in 2017 a very clear polarization. But notice that when we come to the Holyrood election of last year, that 75% figure goes up to 89%. And meanwhile, on the unionist side, if anything, support for the SNP is even lower, it's only 10%. So by the message of the 2021 election is that Scotland was even more polarised than it was in 2017, and in 2017 it was already more polarised than it was in 2012. So it looks likely that the transfer pattern in 2012, 2022, which again could be more important than 2017, could well be even more reflecting the constitutional fault line. But of course, this does raise the fascinating question of the extent to which the parties do or do not realise this and attempt to send signals out to the voters that maybe they might want to be backing the other parties on their line of the unionist fence. Now, as a voter in Glasgow, I have already had innumerable leaflets from those on the unionist side saying, the only way you can stop the SNP here is to vote for us. We're the only party who can stop the SNP. This, of course, if you understand STV, is complete and utter rubbish. If you want to stop the SNP or any party, it's up to you which party you might want to stop. It doesn't matter which party you give your first preference to. The crucial thing is that you just need to use all your preferences on the ballot paper so that the party you don't like is the one you don't give any preferences to. But so far, there is absolutely no sign or appreciation amongst the unionist parties that actually, if they wish to maximize their position in these elections, they might want to send out a few subtle messages that maybe actually, yeah, sure, Labour 1 or 2, Liberal Democrat 3, but Tory 4 and 5 might just be acceptable even for a Labour voter, and equally on the Conservative side. Of course, what's true on the national side is because the Greens have now joined the Scottish government, there has been a stronger signal implicitly on the national side of the argument that maybe that's what you might want to do. Well, anyway, we will see what happens and whether the fragmentation makes a difference. Anyway, this is what I think the implications are. There may well be a battle for second place. That's a battle for first preferences, but the outcome of that battle may also be affected by second preferences. But the crucial thing here about transfers, voters were more amenable in 2017 to expressing preference to more than one party, and those preferences had more impact on the outcome. But in expressing more preferences, voters were less likely to cross the constitutional fault line. And I think it may be true that that will be even more the case in 2022. However, perhaps the degree to which voters do that will vary between yes and no voters. And if that does happen, that may also have implications for the outcome in terms of seats and the way the result of these elections get read, even though maybe the signal will not necessarily be an entirely accurate one so far as Scotland's constitutional preferences are concerned.
Professor Sir John Curtice, thank you very much for that fantastic and exciting run through of the report that's come out today, The Power of Preferences, STV and Scottish local elections. And I think everyone who's participating, and there are hundreds of people on this webinar, we're delighted to say, will have learned a lot about many aspects of what you're discussing, from the basics of the system where you started to the dynamics that have occurred in Scotland. But even for people who are real experts on STV, you've really gone into some quite interesting technical detail there that I think will have been real brain food for a lot of people on the webinar. So thank you very much for doing that, and we look forward to returning to look at the 2022 results. And you've left us with a real cliffhanger about what might be there. So that's good for keeping our interest up. And I think what really struck me, in addition to those points, is that we've now got a series of these STV elections happening in Scotland, and so we can look at them through the prism of changing politics. And I think when you're trying to reform Westminster, you get into a conversation, people want to know about the next election, the last election. And you know, for reformers, we're interested in the architecture, the whole thing, broad sweeps of time. So you've really helped us with our raising awareness on these issues with your independent report. A little pile of questions that have come in. So if I just maybe break into some groups. I want to come to one of the points you made about party behaviour there, but let's start off with voter behaviour from 2017 back to when the last first past the post election was held using for local elections in Scotland. What would you see would be some of those big shifts in voter behaviour? Is it the preferences example you gave us, or are there other things as well?
Oh, well, I mean, the last first past the post local elections in Scotland were in 2003, held on the same day as the Scottish Parliament election of that year. And if you want to go back to the last local elections not held on the same day as an election, you actually have to go back to 1995, which were the first elections to the 32 councils that are now currently held in Scotland. Various points to make on that. I mean, you know, of course, if we're going back to 2003, you know, this is going back to the days when John Sweeney was leader of the SNP. I found it rather a tough gig, and you know, the SNP, of course, you know, the crucial thing that happened in the wake of devolution, well, actually, the crucial thing that happened, in fact, you know, one of the consequences of Black Wednesday in 1992, as the SNP started to emerge as the principal challenger to Labour in Scotland, and that was cemented by the introduction of the Holyrood system. So, you know, the SNP were already the principal challengers to Labour, but Labour dominated local government in Scotland. Though they didn't, I mean, though even then, it should be remembered, I remember this whole debate when we were arguing about, you know, what would be the consequences of introducing STV. Even then, if I remember rightly, of the 32 councils in Scotland, it was something like 17 or 18 that had no overall control. So even with first past the post, we were looking at a majority of councils with no overall control because, you know, Labour, yes, were dominant, but they didn't, and virtually no, but there were, the SNP was strong enough, and occasionally the Conservatives and the Democrats, to deny there being anybody having overall control. So, although under the current system, I mean, actually at the moment, the only councils that have one party in control are the three island councils, which are independents. We might have one or two after the next election. There were one or two after 2012. So yes, we've moved to virtually all no overall control, but we had quite a lot beforehand. So it wasn't as radical a step as people thought, right? But certainly the balance of the parties is different, but that's to do with the independence referendum and how that's just transformed the SNP's position. The other thing I would say, and I think this is where, you know, campaigners for PR need to be honest, is, I mean, the turnout in 2017, which is what, 46%, is basically the same as it was in the 1995 local elections under first past the post, when they were held on their own. Scotland has always tended to have, as compared with England, relatively high turnout in local elections. It's tended to be in the high 40s, whereas in England it's always tended to be in the high 30s. But the introduction of STV has neither improved nor worse, nor made that any worse. It looks as though basically people turn out for reasons that are largely independent of the electoral system. So I think, you know, I've always, to be honest, been somewhat skeptical of the argument that you change the electoral system because more people will turn out and vote. In the end, it's the context of the election that matters, and the incentive. You know, if people think it's a really, really important vote, they'll turn out and vote. If they think it's a boring election for an unimportant institution, you can give them the world's most wonderful system of STV and they still won't bother.
Well, that answers the next question I was actually going to ask you. was going to be on that, because one of our viewers, Peter, asked about that. But you've already answered that question. But there's another question, just sticking with the sort of voter experience side of it, from Jennifer, asking, do you have a view about the importance of individual candidates? Do many people vote for individuals rather than for party labels?
Yes, I mean, I think the fact that independent candidates have, I mean, I think the majority of Central Belt councils have at least one independent council at the moment. And whereas if you go back to the old system, that would be rare, because, you know, it wasn't just that it wasn't, strictly speaking, first past the post, it's multi-member plurality, which makes it even more difficult. So, you know, you're talking about you know, 3 councillors being elected in one ward, which makes it even more difficult for independents. Now, outside, as I said in my remarks, in the rural areas, the independents have become less prevalent, and Highland Council, which used to be dominated by independents, it's now split between, you know, parties, party candidates and independent candidates, and the parties have become stronger in that part of rural Scotland, but not in the islands. In the islands, the Western Isles and the Northern Islands really are still very much independent dominated. So that's clear evidence that individuals can matter, and that non-partisan individuals can matter in a way that wasn't true in the Central Belt and in the previous system. And then and you can certainly also see the way, I mean, the fact that alphabetical, the one group of people who can get across alphabetical voting are independent, are incumbent councillors, shows that some voters do take notice of who their local councillor is, and that some people who just really want to vote Labour, they say, but that's my local Labour councillor, so they do vote for them. So therefore, individuals matter. And as you've also seen, although it may be true that around 3/4 of people, where they've got 2 candidates from the same party, go 1-2, 25% don't, and some of that will be to do with, well, I like that Tory, but I don't like that Tory, or, you know, I'd never vote for Nicola Sturgeon, but, you know, my next door neighbour is a really good local SNP candidate, and, you know, we go out and we have a beer occasionally, and I'm going to vote for her, right? So sure, and of course, you know, given its local politics, then some of those considerations are going to matter more. And but what I would then say is that, you know, those, and that, you know, sometimes local issues will make a difference, right? You know, if a local council is really screwed up the council bin collection, that's a pretty good way of losing votes. There's a lot of complaint in Glasgow about the number of potholes, but these things tend not, once you start adding up across Scotland as a whole, then these things tend to cancel out. And the broad picture, apart from independents doing better than they ever would in a Holyrood election, it will tend to cancel out.
It speaks to the voter choice argument as well, which is quite strong there. We've had quite a few questions in around the party management, or the party response to the change of the system, and I think that's probably sparked by your point about parties trying to work out how many candidates to put up. And it's interesting, as I say, quite a few people have asked about it. Some saying, look, why do they do that? Are they really worried about leakage amongst their own supporters? And so there's another group of people who sent in questions saying, well, parties should put up as many candidates as there are spaces and let us, the voters, choose which ones we want. Don't worry about it. If you,
well,
what do you take on that?
This is to do with the nice technicalities of it. I mean, you know, to be honest, this is one bit of this is the one group of people who, for the most part, learned how the system worked very rapidly were the parties, but doesn't mean they can't make mistakes. So there are 2 risks with STV. You don't want to over-nominate, because if you over-nominate, there is a risk that your candidates will get eliminated from the count earlier than they otherwise would have done, and therefore as a result they don't stay in the count for long enough to benefit from the transfers from other candidates of other parties who get eliminated. So there's a risk, in other words, that your candidates get eliminated early in the count because you've spread your vote too thinly. Whereas what you want to do is to keep candidates in the count for as long as possible, so that you pick up the transfers from other parties. So that's the problem with over-nominating. The problem with under-nominating, however, is that, as I've talked about with the Conservatives, if you do better than you'd expect, then maybe you could have got two, but you've only put up one candidate. And the case of the Conservatives, that's very clearly what happened in 2017, which is one of the reasons why they just didn't convert their votes to seats in the way they should. So that's why, if the parties know what they're doing, how many candidates the parties put up is a good clue as to how well they think they're going to do. They won't admit it, but they do. So that's one aspect. Now, the other thing that parties will do, and I've certainly, Labour are putting up two candidates in my ward, and they're certainly doing it, although where I live, they're asking people to vote for the incumbent candidate as number one. I don't know whether they're doing everywhere or not, but the parties will also try to encourage their voters to if they're putting up more than one candidate, to do so in a certain order. Now, what you want to do to maximize your chances is you want to give half your supporters the instructions Brown 1, Stevens 2, and the other half Stevens 1, Brown 2, so that your vote is roughly evenly divided between your two candidates, so that you maximize the length of time that both of them stay in the count, and therefore maximize your chances. But through a combination, you've got to get enough first preferences, obviously, right? If you're getting enough first preferences, that you're getting 0.8, 0.85 of a count for both of a quota for both of your candidates, then you keep the candidates in the count, you pick up the transfers, bingo, you've got two candidates. All right. So that's why the vote management strategy works. Now, if you don't manage your vote and you get an awful lot of alphabetical voting, your second candidate might get eliminated from the count before they've got a chance to pick up from the transfers, and you miss out on that. You miss out on that last seat, and it's the last seat where managing the transfers becomes crucial.
And this is very interesting, because in this 2022 cycle, we're seeing that in different ways. You gave the example of parties that are on the union side of the argument in Scotland, and it gave a great illustration of that. And it's interesting to watch for the Northern Ireland Assembly, which is also having an election in May and uses STV to choose its MLAs. Interesting to see parties going through a readjustment to some of those polling changes, and then adjusting the number of candidates they're putting up as well. They haven't previously been in a dominant position.
Yeah, the DUP are in a weaker position. The Alliance are in a stronger position. The TUP are in a much stronger position. Yeah,
this is what's so good of being able to take a long view across many elections of what goes on. I had a question in about some of the smaller parties in Scotland. I wonder if you've got a view about whether Alba or the Greens, whether Alba will break through at all, and whether the Greens will make advances on where they've been.
Okay, let's take the Greens first. The Greens, I think it's uncertain. The Greens, I've forgotten how many it is, whether they've got 19 councillors or whatever it is, and all but 4 of them are in Glasgow and Edinburgh. So Edinburgh was the first place where the Greens made a significant breakthrough for Holyrood, and then it's also followed through in Glasgow, and it's in Glasgow where Patrick Harvey is their lead candidate, and it's in Edinburgh where Lorna Slater who's now the co-leader, is also their principal person. So in Glasgow and Edinburgh, the Greens are able to pick up around 12, 13, 14, 15% of the vote, such that in some wards they can get up to the quota with transfers. But outside of Glasgow and Edinburgh, their vote hitherto has been too low. And they therefore find it more difficult than they do under the Holyrood list system. Between 5 and 6% of the vote, and bingo, you're almost undoubtedly going to pick up at least one regional list seat. And if you do that in 8 regions, you've got 8 seats, right? 8 out of 129. That's a pretty good reward. This system, you can get 5-6% of the vote, and you end up with nothing. So the crucial question is, I mean, the Greens are riding relatively high at the moment. Indeed, they had a record high in one recent poll. But actually, they were also fairly high in the polls back in 2017 as well. So how much better they were going to do, I think, is highly uncertain. And whether they're going to do well enough to start picking up more than the odd seat outside Glasgow and Edinburgh, I think is still very, very much up in the lap of the gods now. And they could end up even, getting 2 or 3% more of the first preference vote, but still end up being very much a Glasgow and Edinburgh party.
And I'm sorry, John, I was just checking the next set of questions. Did you cover Alba?
Oh, sorry, no, I got so interested in the Greens, I forgot about it. Right, for those of you not familiar with Scottish politics, Alba Party is the party that Alex Salmond has formed. It's basically characterized by being markedly more socially conservative than either the SNP and certainly the Greens, particularly on the row about the Gender Recognition Act in Scotland, Gender Recognition Bill in Scotland. But it is also much more determined, saying, Nicola Sturgeon is fit, she'll never get around to holding a referendum, blah, blah, blah. They've got 1 or 2 councillors who are trying to defend their seats because there are people who defected from the SNP, and maybe 1 or 2 of those have got sufficient personal votes that they will make it. But Alba's registering about 2-3% of the vote, and it follows from what I've previously said. That just is not anything like enough for you to be able to pick up very much in the way of seats. The other party that's fighting, I think it's put up just over 80 candidates, is the Scottish Family Party, which, as you can guess, is again, family issues and gender recognition, all the rest of that. But again, unlikely to trouble the scorer. The system was very carefully divided. I mean, Labour was very carefully devised by Labour and the Democrats to maximise their chances and minimise the chances of the Greens, let alone anybody else. Now, hasn't quite saved the Labour Party from its fate, but it's certainly made life more difficult for the Greens, and it's certainly kept out anybody else.
Well, so speaking of the Labour Party, we have a question from Kezia Dugdale of the John Smith Centre, but also the former leader of the Scottish Labour Party at Holyrood. And Kezia asks, is there any suggestion that you can see that voters see race or gender on the ballot paper in either a negative or a positive fashion?
I think somewhere along the lines in doing analysis of this report, I checked whether there was any evidence that female candidates were doing worse than male candidates. And I think the answer to the answer was no. The truth is there's no evidence these days from first past the post elections that it makes the gender of a candidate makes any difference. And how many women get elected basically depends on where they get nominated for, rather than anything to do with preference one way or another for female candidates. On race, I have to be honest, Kezia, I do not think that we attempted to code the gender of the candidates. You can just about do that for Westminster and get it reasonably right, although obviously it's becoming more problematic. I think getting the information accurately for local government elections is probably too difficult, but maybe it's something we'll think about for 2022, because certainly it's noticeable that perhaps rather more ethnic minority candidates are standing. It's perhaps worth pursuing.
Thank you.
We'll make a note of that, Darren, for the next report.
There we are. We'll follow up for the next report. We're already starting our next work plan. Not a single ballot's been cast yet. We've just got a couple of minutes, so 2 or 3 quick questions maybe. John's asking a question that will be very relevant for anyone watching in Australia with the federal election on next month. Do parties give their supporters advice on what to do with their further preferences once they've voted for all the candidates of their own party?
No,
how to vote.
no, and it is the fact that they're not doing so on the unionist side, which I am suggesting is potentially to the disadvantage of the unionist side collectively.
Right, and then we also had a question about if you were given the choice, you alone had the choice on the issue of randomization of the presentation on the ballot paper. What side would you come down on if that was up to you?
I think, but returning officers would murder me, is that I would go for randomization by blocks of polling stations. So voting papers were faced with ballot papers in different orders in different wards. But the argument against, and this was certainly something that the Scottish government were in the end, I think, quite strongly influenced by, is that disability groups argue that anything other than alphabetical order is potentially disadvantageous for people with a disability, and that maybe in the end is indeed a crucial argument. But in an ideal world, you would randomise, but you would randomise in different ways in different parts. So, the parties wouldn't like that, and the returning officers wouldn't like it. But if you really want to get together, but the other way, of course, of getting around, I mean, in part, the answer to the problem of alphabetic voting lies in the hands of parties. If parties were more effective at managing their vote, then alphabetical voting would also be reduced.
Thank you. And then maybe just a final one to wrap up, having gone through this great analysis of the results in Scotland. What can England learn for this, where there's such a long way to go to get STV for local elections, but we're campaigning as hard as we can for it?
Oh, what can we? Well, I think the crucial point is that, well, 2 points. One is that insofar as one of the things that a lot of people want to keep for Westminster, etc., is still the idea that that MPs are individually accountable, then certainly the experience of Scotland shows that individuals can be accountable, because voters do seem to take notice of the individual qualities of candidates, at least in terms of their willingness to vote for independent candidates. So that matters. And secondly, that indeed voters can express some more nuanced choice, and that certainly it would be an interesting speculation if, I mean, to be honest, if we had virtually any system of proportional representation, we can have an interesting debate as to whether or not Brexit would ever have happened. But that certainly in 2019, if those on the Remain side had STV and had the ability to organise themselves and had got Labour and Democrat voters to give lower preferences to voters on their side of the argument, again, the outcome might have been different. So, I mean, that's just not to advocate that, but the point is that I show you with 2017, a system that expresses transfers does mean that you can express a more subtle set of preferences. Now, in some instances, that might mean that the centre gains, which is what some people have said STV does, but also STV can also actually, I think, accurately reflect the situation when you've got strong demarcation from one block to another. Now, so whatever way, STV does therefore potentially enable voters to express somewhat more nuanced preferences than virtually any other system.
Indeed, and that's a point we've had from Keith as well, about even if they're not putting up a full slate, there's still more choice under STV than there is under first past the post. We better bring this to a close, because strict Zoom etiquette means you can't go over without shattering people's faith in the format. But I want to thank Professor Sir John Curtice for this report, which has come out today.